Welcome back. As I mentioned in my opening remarks yesterday, solving the grand challenges really isn't simply just a scientific, engineering, or policy venture. It's something that's very much related to an important set of normative and distributive questions. And so we thought it was very appropriate to conclude the grand challenges with a broad discussion of these issues under the heading of environmental justice. I'd very much like to thank the Policy Research Institute for the region, the Center for Human Values, and the Center for African American Studies for sponsoring this panel. Now let me introduce the moderator. The moderator is Kimberly Smith, who's an associate professor of political science at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. She earned her PhD at the University of Michigan and her law degree at the Bolt School of Law at Berkeley. And she teaches constitutional law, judicial process, American political thought, political theory, and environmental politics. She is the author of 3 books: The Dominion of Voice, Riot, Reason, and Romance in the Antebellum Politics, Wendell Berry and the Agrarian Tradition, A Common Grace, and finally, and perhaps most relevant to today's discussion, African American Environmental Thought Foundations, which was published in the spring of 2007. We're currently happy that Professor Smith is visiting us this year as the Currie C. and Thomas A. Barron Visiting Professor at the Princeton Environmental Institute and is a visiting professor at the Princeton Center for African American Studies. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming today. The environmental justice movement is aimed at addressing the environmental problems of impoverished and marginalized communities such as urban neighborhoods plagued by concentrated racialized poverty. Not only are these communities often overlooked in national environmental policy debate, many of the standard solutions for environmental problems simply don't work there. So these are the sorts of intractable problems that the Grand Challenges program is aimed at solving. They need creative approaches that are sensitive to the heightened vulnerability of the poor, the history of racial discrimination that these communities have had to deal with, and the pressing need for both economic development and environmental remediation. Now, the environmental justice movement has been pretty successful at putting these issues on the agenda at all levels of government. We're seeing a steady increase in legislation and regulatory policies, especially at the state level, to address problems identified by environmental justice activists. This concern has been institutionalized at the highest level in the EPA and in President Clinton's executive order number 12898, directing federal agencies to develop environmental justice policies. But I think there's a sense in the environmental justice community that we're just getting started, that this movement has the potential to really transform environmental management. Although in its early days, the movement drew much of its energy from fairly narrow and local conflicts over siting decisions, most environmental justice activists today are talking about a much broader range of issues. How do we make sustainable development work in the inner cities? How can we get a more equitable distribution of resources, along with overall reductions in pollution in metropolitan areas? How can we integrate environmental and equity goals into our housing, transportation, and economic development policies? Now, it's hard for me to imagine a set of speakers better qualified to talk about those questions than the ones we have here today. We're going to begin with Marty Johnson. I know Marty Johnson in his capacity as the founder and executive director of ISLES, a Trenton-based community development organization that's been tackling the challenges to sustainable development in one of the most economically depressed and racially segregated cities in the country. For over 25 years, ISLES has been developing innovative programs addressing the interconnected problems of housing, job training, green space development, pollution, and energy efficiency in low-income urban neighborhoods. In his spare time, he's chairman of the New Jersey Regional Coalition, trustee of the Capital Health System, trustee of the Capital City Redevelopment Corporation, and the National Housing Institute. He's also a former trustee and executive committee member of Princeton University and taught at the Woodrow Wilson School from 1996 to 97.
Thank you, Kimberly, and it's great to be back here. The grand challenges. I love it. Everybody wants to talk at the grand challenges. It's not so easy to break the issues down into tight silos when you're talking about grand challenges. In fact, that's the reason that it's called a grand challenge, and that's certainly true with the environmental justice issue. So we're going to be talking as Kimberly might have implied, we're going to be talking about a fairly broad range of issues that are embedded with environmental justice. And we have an urban focus, and there could be other foci here too, but today we're going to have an urban focus with this panel. And thinking about this issue and what to do, I first thought about the challenges in Trenton and the kind of environmental hazards that are shouldered by those that can least afford to shoulder them, and that's a grand challenge. But to me, the really grand challenge is the bigger picture here, which is that if we can't find a way to make cities work, as a species we're imperiled. We're basically in trouble. And so that is a really big grand challenge. It forces us to ask a different question, which is how can we make cities work? So this presentation, I'm going to give a quick overview of what we do and the challenges that are going on in Trenton, but also I'm going to talk a little bit about the demographic shifts that are impacting us there and are impacting Princeton here and throughout the region. And it's not just unique to Central Jersey, it's happening in other areas, and those are indeed environmental justice challenges, we think. Hopefully, given the short amount of time, we have only 15 minutes to talk, I hope that we'll stimulate some questions that we can talk about when we're all done. First, I guess we'll turn the lights down so we can start this. ISLES was incorporated 2 days ago, 27 years ago, here on campus by some of us students and a handful of faculty who thought that we could find a better way to promote development in places outside of the economic mainstream and do it in a way that's environmentally sound as well as controlled by those that it's intended to serve and meet important economic goals. And so one of the areas, we have 5 core departments within our organization, soon to be 6, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The first is an alternative high school, which we call our Youth Build Institute, where we're training young people in the construction trades and other vocations while they're getting their high school diploma. We also have a community planning and research arm of the organization, where we're working with community groups to develop their own master plans and to participate in guiding the interventions that are happening in their neighborhoods. Another arm of the organization is financial self-reliance. This is financial literacy, supercharged savings accounts, micro-business, micro-lending, as well as home ownership development. And then we have a real estate arm of the organization. This is where we're doing energy-efficient housing, both renovation of older stock as well as new construction. And finally, we have an environment and community health arm of the organization, which is focused on cleaning up environmental hazards, growing food in the city of Trenton, where there are no supermarkets, and engaging in broader community health activities. And this great work over 27 years, we've developed hundreds of homes and lots of trainees and lots of important stuff, right? But a couple things that I want to just start with for a few moments that I think are key. First is to take a look at this slide. This shows you that top line is the county of Mercer population growth since 1940. The bottom line is the city of Trenton's population shrinkage. It's bottomed out at about 84,000 as of today, but this is the face of sprawl in this area as we speak. What's also happening here, if you go back to this 89 data, you see the lighter shades there are the higher numbers of families below the median income. And if you take a look at 89 and then compare that to just 10 years later, you see that increasing concentrations of poverty as well as the expansion of lower-income households outward. Looking at it at the county level, this is, you get a chance to see Trenton here at the bottom lower left-hand side. The darker the reds, the deeper the poverty. And I guess that area right there, pay no attention to that. That's a psychiatric hospital. That goes away 10 years later. But in 10 years, take a look at how that deepens and spreads. So it's certainly disrespecting the municipal boundaries, and we're seeing the lower-income households moving their way out in the region. Part of what is happening here, which is worth taking note of, I think, for a moment, is there were families that are fleeing the city of Trenton for their better piece of land, better school for their kids, and many of them are folks of color, and then this is the face of white flight from the first ring around the suburbs, which raises lots of interesting challenges for us. Where are people moving to? This is where they're moving to, ultimately. The blues are where folks are moving in this area. The growth rate for this 10-year period of time is right around 10% for the state of New Jersey. So you can see where that sort of flight is occurring, starting to move its way up towards campus here. Just so you can see that this isn't just unique to our neck of the woods here in New Jersey. This is happening not just here in central Jersey, but you can see Camden and other places where that flight is happening out of urban areas and then out of the first and now second and third ring suburbs. The elementary school students are the canary in the coal mine, so we looked at the elementary student eligibility for free lunch in this county, and we did this statewide as well, and you can see this growth of children. The oranges are where it's increasing, and the blues are where it's actually getting better. So it's a little bit confusing in Trenton. It looks like Trenton is doing very well, but it's really because they stopped sending notes home with the students because so many children were qualifying that it didn't matter anymore. The wealthiest elementary school has 80% of the students not qualifying for free lunch. The wealthiest elementary school has 80%. So this starts to get to the trends that are happening here. The implications of this are, this is a breakdown of school segregation. And if 100 is a total apartheid, we're tied for third, if you're Latino, third worst in the country in terms of school segregation. If you're African American, we're the fifth worst. But the interesting data is here. We have more poor students going to school with other poor students than any other state in the country by a substantial margin. Important implications from an environmental justice perspective, I think. This is a critical part of the environment. A couple of quick things that relate just to the environment of Trenton. This is a map, if you would, from the sky of the heat islands in the city. So this is taken at this is the land surface temperature taken at 10:30 in the morning. And one thing to keep in mind, I don't know if you remember those maps of where the poverty is in the city, but this area here is where the high poverty areas are. They also happen to be the hottest part of the city. If you look at the vegetative index here, this shows you how much the relationship is between the heat islands and the vegetation. You see a pretty denuded city. Out here in the western, northern part of the city, it's a little bit better. But again, interesting regionalization of this challenge. From a lead poisoning perspective, we have actually what we're finding out is very startling. Nobody has really done an analysis of the challenge of lead poisoning in Trenton. What we are getting is a little bit of data like this that you see in front of you. The problem is that less than 40% of the Trenton kids are ever tested, and that 6% had lead levels of 10 plus micrograms per deciliter, which is the lion's share of the damage is being done to the brain between 5 and 10. And so what's going on here is one indicator how much worse it is than the rest of New Jersey. But to us, the really frightening aspect of this is that the state of New Jersey will not intervene until a child is tested twice at 15, that's that parts per deciliter, or once at 20. So in effect, what we're doing is we're using children as lead detectors, and then we're intervening when it's too late. And so we have this enormous challenge right now that nobody really understands, that we're starting to get our arms around. We tested 420 homes recently to look at the impact of, well, to look at the lead and the dust in the homes. This isn't behind the walls, or, you know, these kids aren't getting lead poisoning from chewing on the baseboards. They're getting it from living in their homes and putting their hands in their mouths. And so this is just a little indicator here of the homes that tested positive in the red. So their distribution throughout the city is pretty diverse, and not necessarily targeting just that one area. But as we get further on, we're going to do another 400 homes over the next 18 months, and we'll get a better handle on again, the targeting of that. But a big unknown problem still in Trenton. We also have brownfields. We have 90 brownfield sites. This is a map of where they exist. Again, they're mostly in those areas which are lower income, especially in the North Ward there of the city. And then we've got, let's take a look at energy. We have imagined the city of Trenton being a place where there's quite a few what we would call energy hogs. We've got, of 33,000 household units, we've got 12,000 or so that are substandard, meaning in pretty bad shape. Each of them are using an enormous amount of energy that as we're discovering, and we have some systemic problems as to why that's the case, but it's having a big impact on our region's carbon footprint. So the question is, so what? What do we do about it? First thing is to understand that there is a relationship between household income and energy cost per household. So what you'll see over these next handful of slides is that the wealthier you are, the lower the per household member, the lower the per square foot costs are for energy. So you can see this graph is a space heating consumption by square foot. You can see how the wealthier you are, the lower the costs are. And then here is the total energy consumption by square foot and household income, the same kind of thing. We're seeing folks who can least afford the burden of these energy costs, which have been going up well beyond inflation over the last few years, how that happens. A couple of environmental justice indicators that I would look at if I'm being asked to talk about environmental justice in the context of our work. First, on the air side, Trenton is one of the, we're looking into this data, but we're one of the most challenged cities in the country when it comes to deaths relating to diesel-based particulate matter. So our air quality is challenged. From a water perspective, we have a water systems infrastructure challenge that's immense. We have some water pipes under the streets that are 100-plus years old, lots of lead in the joints, and lots of lead coming out of the taps, even if it's good coming out of the water treatment facility. Soil quality, background lead levels in the city of Trenton, probably 1/3 of the city, although nobody has done this, and we're talking with some folks here about trying to help us get better data on this, but probably 1/3 of the city has background lead levels that would not allow you to build in 1/3 of the city without remediating that soil. So a lot of kids are playing in dirt that's filled with lead. From an energy cost, from indoor health perspective, we have those challenges that we've discussed. Asthma is a critical issue right now, and Trenton's burden from an asthma perspective is far more than double the rest of the county's burden in terms of the populations. From an energy cost perspective, we're just getting our arms around that, and our 6th department within our organization is going to be focusing in on energy, both how to make it more efficient and how to create more of it in a distributed manner, in a more environmentally sound manner. Ambient air temperature, so if you're living in the city and it's a July day and you're down on the street corner, it's hot, and it makes people do some crazy things sometimes. But that's something we can do something about. On the brownfield side, we have land values in the city of Trenton that are oftentimes negative. So that means that a cost you $100,000 to build a home, it'll be worth $80,000. So what do you do when you've got lots of land around that's contaminated and developers can't make any money off of it? It just sits there. It becomes a public health issue. It becomes a real challenge to neighborhood quality of life. On the neighborhood side, there's obviously segregated communities that we think are important to map over time. Security of tenure is important. This is the train wreck coming for us. We look 10 years down the road, and we know how much better it is to live in cities, how much better it is from a carbon footprint perspective to be in high-density areas. And so the pressure is on. How do we repopulate these places? Trenton has more than 56% of its residents renting. The vast majority of them, 90% of them, are renting from the private marketplace. That's the train wreck. How do we create a way for us to avoid the refugee problem that would ensue if we were to re-gentrify the city and create some population levels that were similar to what they were 40 years ago that you just saw? And finally, the public investments that we've been making as a community. Those of us that live around here, we pay a tax on our utility bill. It goes into a societal benefits fund. That fund goes out and supports environmental energy, well, energy efficiency as well as other kinds of alternative energy. Very little of that money has made its way into these neighborhoods. And there are a variety of structural reasons why that they're not making it into those neighborhoods. But from a public sector, they are looking to shift growth to the cities. There's a big push that's we're in the midst of right now. A lot of reasons why that they're acknowledging, some reasons that they're not acknowledging why this is important to do. But as we talked about, there are a number of challenges that we face that we've got to get beyond. And I trust that with this bad news that it's important that you see some good news. And the good news is that we know a lot more now after 27 years of doing this work on the ground. And we can take that learning and we can apply it to some important stuff that's happening both at the policy level and moving its way on down. And I'm running out of time here, but I guess that we'll have a chance to talk more about these kinds of activities that we're doing on a shoestring budget to really have an impact. In terms of coming up here to Princeton and talking about this stuff, you know, I have a Chinese proverb next to my desk, and it says, to know and not to do is to not yet know. And so we're at a point now where we know a lot. We're pretty smart about a lot of things, but it's time that we do. And it's our, you know, when you live and work in the shadows of the university and the resources that are so extraordinary here, you really grow to appreciate, you know, the wisdom of that proverb. So I appreciate you all being here and trying to both know and I trust do something about this. Thanks again.
Thank you, Marty. George Hawkins has a long and impressive record of leadership in environmental policy, and especially the environmental challenges of urban areas. Currently, he is the director of the District Department of the Environment for Washington, D.C., which involves him in all dimensions of urban environmental management, from reducing the risks of lead poisoning to children, to dealing with stormwater runoff and wastewater treatment, to providing support for low-income residents for energy costs. He serves as the chair of the Green Building Advisory Council and is a member of the Green Collar Jobs Advisory Committee. As chair of the Mayor's Green Team, he helps to coordinate the district's sustainability program across more than 40 agencies. Prior to coming to the district, George was the executive director of New Jersey Future, a statewide nonprofit focused on smart growth.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here because one of the things, thank you for the introduction. I'm always delighted to be on a panel with Marty, who's been one of my heroes for a very long time. I've known his wife and his kids, and I believe Marty embodies the Princeton in the nation's service tradition, so I'm delighted. But I also am glad to be in this particular room because the first day of class, my first fall, when I was a freshman at Princeton, I sat in the back row, which started a long habit of mine of always sitting in the back row if I could. But I always like coming back to this particular room in measure. And I'm really pleased to be here on this topic. I know many of you probably know a lot sort of on environmental justice, and I'm going to try to tell the story through the history of Washington, well, not a history, but a synopsis of what's going on in the nation's capital, which is a fascinating place. I've done 4 tours of duty in D.C. over the years. I go there for a while, I do lots of fun stuff, and then I get so frustrated I leave and come to New Jersey or Boston, then I go back again and have at it for a while, and then I leave and I come back. So I've seen it change quite a bit, because my first tour in D.C. was in 1979, and during the summers, actually most of my time at Princeton, because my father was working in Washington and I worked there, and I've just seen the city change so much. And it's really been, in large measure, a question that's been connected to environmental justice. The classic notion, very good outline of environmental justice, and I'm an environmental lawyer, so the classic notion of environmental justice very much came up with legal issues in mind. And as you already heard, the classic, and this is a lousy picture of Washington, D.C., but this is supposed to be a Monet painting view of not only D.C., but of any of the issues I talk about. Just enough for you to get a sense of what they are, but not too detailed, because then I don't have my staff here to bail me out when you ask hard questions. But the notion of D.C., just so you can try to put this picture, is here's the Potomac, Rock Creek Park, and the Anacostia River, 3 rivers that flow into the Chesapeake. So one of the major parts that D.C. has is a significant part of trying to clean up the Chesapeake. D.C. is divided into 4 quadrants, as most of you know, centered on the Capitol. North Capitol Street, South Capitol Street is the dividing line. So you have Northwest Washington, it's from Constitution Ave and North Capitol Street to the north and the west, with Rock Creek Park and the Potomac being the 2 water bodies that define it. Northeast is what most of the Anacostia flows through. That's on the other side of North Capitol Street. Southeast is to the south. This is an area, it's much bigger than how this picture shows. Southwest is a very small part of D.C. And actually D.C., as you may know, was supposed to have a big chunk of Virginia. But in the Civil War, when Virginia secedes from the Union, that part of D.C. never was taken out and never went back in, which all sorts of bothers me now that I'm a D.C. resident. I mean, it shouldn't be that Virginia didn't give its part to D.C. because they seceded from the Union in the bloody Civil War. We should have taken it back, which means we'd have Old Town and also other parts would be part of D.C. But there was a true triangle. That's true. Well, maybe we could vote at that part. We don't vote in D.C., which is an aggravation. But the environmental justice, the notion of environmental justice, and I link this to what the phrase I hear a lot now very much was African-American communities, but the phrase I'm generally hearing is at risk, because there's a variety. It is African-American communities, Hispanic, a lot of immigrants who are coming into the country. It's also all about money, obviously, and it's all about power. And the issue is that as these 3 topics combine, issues of environmental justice dictate how decisions are made about the placement on all sorts. Siting is the big one. You hear it all the time. Where do you put a hazardous waste facility? There's no landfills in Washington, D.C. So all the trash we collect in D.C. goes to a trash transfer station first, where it's all piled in these gigantic buildings, and then it's taken from there off to landfills in other places. So the question is, where do you put one of those things? Where do you put a wastewater treatment plant? Where do you put your cement plant? Where do you put your metal finishing facilities? All the kind of stuff that I bet none of us would want in our neighborhood if we had a choice. And most of us do have a choice and would fight it if they tried to stick the incinerator next to you. So the question is, when you site most of these facilities, and where are they in fact, the notion of D.C. historically is that the poorer parts of the city were these 3 quadrants. There's actually pockets in Northwest that are also lower income, but the historically poor areas are these 3 pockets. East of the river means east of the Anacostia, which is this part of Washington, D.C. Most people who go to D.C. have never seen it unless they happen to fly over in a plane and look down from above. Most people have never been to the east of the river part of the Anacostia. It's an extremely poor neighborhoods. The largest advanced wastewater treatment plant in the world is right here, all along the Anacostia. That is where the big cement plant is. 2 Pepco facilities, big power plants, not actually used much anymore, are all along the Anacostia. This was the area where most of the trash transfer stations, my office actually is right here. I'm in the midst of all this. But the trash transfer stations for D.C. were in this neighborhood. So the idea was, when any of the siting decisions over these kinds of facilities that most folks don't want they get put into neighborhoods with at-risk populations who don't have a lot of money to fight it or don't have a lot of power to fight it. And I must say, you watch these things happen, and it's not that rich folks don't have the chance of things being sited in their neighborhood. Because I have been involved in fighting some of them off on an isolated, you come try to put something, the incinerator battle that was done in this area. It's just So what happens if you try to do this in a wealthy neighborhood is that the wealthy folks, and there's nothing, I don't think this is a problem. It's just what you do is you hire lawyers, you have, what firepower does that give you to use the system and fight back? So almost by nature in this system, these systems, these decisions end up populating these areas of low income, at-risk populations with all sorts of uses that are tough. And they get multiple locations. And then those neighborhoods start to decline. Because you now have a neighborhood that has the waste treatment plant, the trash transfer station, has the wastewater treatment plant, and I'm on the board of the Washington Area Sewer Authority, is what that's called. It is the largest, and it's enormous, because it serves Maryland and Virginia as well, and it stinks to high heaven. As you'd expect, there are neighborhoods all around this. This is not in the middle of nowhere. This is next to where people live. And you're not going to put a high-rent district down here, or there, folks who lived here, if they had a choice, might have fought it. But if it was a choice between putting it here, here's Northwest, but in between Rock Creek and the Potomac is Georgetown. Georgetown didn't even let the metro come into their town, let alone a wastewater treatment plant, which is, by the way, one of the dumbest decisions a town has ever made in the history of the universe, was not having the metro go into Georgetown. Because everybody still goes there. They just can't get there by metro, so they all drive, and it's impossible if you live in Georgetown, to get around, because it's a mess. But it will never, none of these facilities are in Georgetown. None of them. They're populated here. So that's the classic notion of environmental justice. The second, and that's unsighted. The other is the notion of cleanups. So you saw Marty's graphic of Trenton with all those brownfields. And you've got a number of places around the city from historic uses. By the way, up here in northwest Washington, there's a fascinating area that we're doing a cleanup now. In World War I, the United States was testing mortar shells that had arsenic in it. And they actually had a big park up here. This is now where American University is. And they had the mortars on one side, and they'd actually shoot the shells off to the other side to make sure they'd work with the arsenic in it. So they were doing testing of these shells just in case we had to use them against the Germans. And then they covered it all over and built some of the biggest, wealthiest houses. All sorts of ambassadors live out there. And now they've got this huge project to go down and try to find these shells, and there's all these containment systems, and there's a military, it's a top secret. I couldn't tell you some of the things I know about it, but that was up here. No more. You don't put those things. This is now, but the notion is the total amount of funds that exist for the United States of America for the cleanup of these kinds of sites. This site has absorbed something like 25% of all the funds available for the USA. Because you know who's here. And the House, I can't remember now, was the Speaker of the House. Just all sorts of very powerful folks live there. And they find one little arsenic shell under there, which is a bad thing. It's no one's arguing that it's not worthy of attention. There are all sorts of problems in the rest of D.C. that would warrant attention of that. Not the same problem of arsenic shells per se. A lot of naval facilities, a lot of military facilities. These issues exist elsewhere. The money goes here. So it's not just where you site a facility. It's where you do your cleanups, where you invest your time, and environmental justice goes to general services. Which streets get cleaned faster, where gets the police response to fast, where do you put your resources, and the same model goes across. You can take this map, arguably, and expand it or contract it almost as big or as small as you want it to be. In any town, even if it's a wealthy town, you'll have that part of town where you put these things. And usually that's the town where you're going to see at-risk youth with less at-risk populations with less money and less power. That's why they go there. Or you could put this on a big national scale. You could argue that a lot of the old kind of manufacturing facilities, which don't exist much in Trenton anymore, and almost never did in D.C. unless they were military related, but they're now being shipped across the seas. So this shift of where good things are, you could say this is the westernized countries, and these are some of the third world countries, and now you have a split that's international. So the classic notion of environmental justice, in my view, is still very much alive. But in large, it's shifted to some extent on an international basis as to where you're sending these. You hear these stories about the terrible hazardous wastes that are being sent to Africa and the way they're being processed. It's just, it's good that could not happen in this country unless you were violating the law, and if we caught you, we'd throw you in jail. There are other countries where that happens every day and they make money from it. And that's this same concept. What's changed in D.C. in the last 20 years? because it's the suggestion, and I've taken this from Marty, which is, I remember we were all talking about smart growth when I was in New Jersey Future, let's build cities. The speech I usually give, and the reason I'm in Washington, D.C., I start this presentation and I always say 65, and Stephen Bacall's in the audience, so I may have this wrong, but it sounds good anyways, is that 65 million years ago, an asteroid, that's the atmosphere, scientists say, crashes into our atmosphere, streaks towards the planet, pow, hits the Yucatan Peninsula. It's a piece of rock about the size of Trenton, I think, in its scale. It hits so hard that liquefied rock is shot up into the air, two heights of the Himalayas, completely changes the weather. Tsunamis would make ones that we've seen look like a puddle. I mean, it just completely changes the entire planet. And within 10,000 years of the moment of that impact, 50% of the species that had been alive at that moment are in the city, and then the best by far was green in the city. And I live in an apartment in the Shaw neighborhood of Washington, D.C., and all the heat I use to heat my apartment helps heat my neighbors to the three sides of me, and all their heat helps heat me. And my little place, even if I were wealthy, which I'm not, but if I were and bought one of the bigger places, it wouldn't be nearly the size of the homes I've had when I've had single-family homes. You just don't do that when you're in a city. Even if you have a nice big townhouse, it'll probably be the size of an average three-bedroom home. That's the single. So it's much smaller. And D.C. has the second highest metro rate public transportation to New York City in the country. I walk to work every day. I don't own a car. My personal carbon footprint is much smaller. So I'm not in a green building, although I've changed all my light bulbs. I do all that stuff. But what this chart to me is showing, because what it doesn't indicate is land consumption per acreage or any of the other uses of this notion of spreading. You saw the numbers that Marty had on that chart, which are dramatic. Mercer County is growing in population as folks have just spread out over the landscape, while Trenton decreases in population. So we spread out from the core, whereas all these efficiencies, and left the city behind. My own personal view is that this country has had a pathetic urban policy for the last 30 years. Pathetic. It's almost criminal how we have abandoned cities nationwide. But here's the challenge, and this is why I think environmental justice is changing so dramatically, and it certainly has changed in D.C., reason I'm in D.C., I had a great time in New Jersey. I love New Jersey. Who could not like a state? When they did, many of you are either from New Jersey or here for school or something, they had a contest on the internet for the state phrase in New Jersey. And the one that won, it was not adopted by Corzine, but the one that won is New Jersey. You got a problem with that? Who could not like living in that state? I like living in New Jersey. There's everything in New Jersey. But the reason I left the Garden State to go down to D.C. is because I truly believe I truly believe this, and it sort of goes along with Marty's proverb, which I have seen in his office. That is a true story, is you can't believe what I believe and not do this work. If I truly believe we're at a species extinction rate, I don't wonder whether global warming is happening. We're facing for our species a catastrophe. And to me, you can't think that and then go on your merry way and do something else unless there's something wrong. So I'm not claiming any credit for it. I feel I have to work on trying to make cities go. And in Washington, D.C., the District Department of Environment is the city, it's the county, it's the state, and it's the feds. So we've got everything in our department, from regulating every development, from reviewing every development, lead, paint, energy, all that stuff is in one place. And trying to figure out how this works, and it's tough. It's a tough effort, although I have to say it's the most invigorating, if most demanding job I've ever had. It's fascinating. But here's what's happened in D.C. It's worked. When I was in D.C. 25 years ago, the city had collapsed. Population were leaving, Maryland, Virginia, the suburbs growing like crazy, the classic suburban sprawl story. What happened in D.C. is a combination of things. First, it is so freaking hard to get around D.C. if you're outside, that all of a sudden, and I think this is going to happen with sprawl everywhere, it's not so much fun. My generation, a lot of our generation got sold a bill of goods. Let's move out to that house on a cul-de-sac out there somewhere yonder. And you know, when I grew up, I lived in Smart Growth. I didn't know it. My parents didn't know it. But I walked to school, I walked to church, I walked to the store, I rode my bike, I learned how to wrestle at the Y. And we all lived in these places. And I just walked outside to play with my friends. There's 52 kids on my street. 52 kids on my street. Now what you do when you live on a cul-de-sac, you drive your kids to a play date. A parent has to drive their kids everywhere. Every day you drive more in a car living in suburban New Jersey than you would have driven in a month if you just could walk places. That's not true in cities. Cities are set up to do this. It's better for health. You get outside, you walk more. You get to know your neighbors because you can. But so in D.C., it starts to happen. One is the outskirts get so hard to live in, people start streaming back into the city, particularly young folks. You're 25 years old, you just come out of this graduate program and you want to work in D.C., you don't want to live out in the hinterlands, you want to be downtown, you want to be where things are happening. So you move back into the city. The second thing that happens is there was a control board. My friend Tony Williams, who I went to law school, becomes the mayor, very capable, so we start running the city better, just mechanics, picking up the trash, police response, things that people need in their cities. So people start streaming back in. So now what's happening? There's now there's 8 wards in D.C. And now the question is, what about the 9th ward, which is Prince George's County? The folks who live in D.C. who are lower income are being displaced in huge numbers by all the folks who are coming back. And it's caused a whole new connection along the Anacostia. I'm responsible for the Anacostia cleanup plan for the city. This would have been a place that a developer wouldn't have gone if you paid him 20 years ago. Today, it is the most sought-after area. The brand-new Nationals baseball park. I was there the first night. The first LEED Silver, first LEED certified baseball park in the United States of America, right on the Anacostia. Right across is Poplar Point. A gigantic development is proposed here. All along the Anacostia River, the developments that are coming in. I stopped, almost lost my job my first week, because they were going to put in a gigantic big box store with a huge parking lot up in an old fort. There was a range of forts that went around D.C. to protect it from the Civil War. And they were going to take it all out, take all the wetlands, and stick a gigantic big box store, and I just wouldn't approve it. But that's all happening in areas of the city that no one paid any attention to. And now we're seeing a splintering on a number of fronts. First is folks are being displaced, and there's a huge challenge with affordable housing in the district. The second question, and that's a good thing. We want these businesses to come back. This is a problem of success, but success has born a new challenge, which is where are these folks supposed to live? The second challenge, Poplar Point, a gigantic development project, $1 billion. There is a split now between the environmentalists and the environmental justice advocates in the community here. Because the environmentalists all could mostly chime in on this. We can agree. Let's battle over the siting of sites or the cleanups of sites. On Poplar Point, by and large, the environmentalists are lined up in less development. Let's protect Poplar Point. Let's have it as a natural area. The community activists from Ward 8 have said, we haven't had a job creation in our ward in 30 years. We want to see new development. This is going to be the first set of mixed-use stores and restaurants. There are no restaurants hardly over here. It's the story of Trenton without they're going to have a supermarket. They're going to build into this all sorts of amenities that that neighborhood has not had for decades. So now the community, not all of it, it's all split now. There's no clear voice. Some members of the community are siding with the environmental effort. Let's protect more of this open land. Some members of the communities are absolutely in favor of the development of the project, and with more development, not less. And all of a sudden you end up with a splintering, sort of the classic environmental justice advocates, into a range, and there's no clear yes or no answer as to whether this is a good idea or not. And I think that's what's coming. And what Marty was talking about, and you'll hear more about, is the question is say this is what we want around the country. We want cities to come back like D.C. has. We now have 650,000 people in D.C. It was down to about 500,000 for a while, so exactly the same story. Population storming back. The comment in D.C. is that the state bird of D.C. is the crane. Because there are so many buildings being built. I mean, I live in Shaw, which was a neighborhood 20 years ago. If I'd have walked in it, I would have been shot. Oh, I'd have to wrap up. Me talking too long? The neighborhood I live in now is the neighborhood that got burned to the ground after Martin Luther King. Shaw neighborhood, all through where I live. It is now the townhouse I'm living in, a little basement, English basement apartment. You want to know why a basement is an English basement apartment? I thought it was a basement apartment. English basement has a little window. So if any of you are renting an apartment, they'll charge you extra for that little window to see people's feet going by. But I live in a little basement apartment in Shaw in a townhouse, and there's still shootings. We have our neighborhood gangs, I was telling Marty, fighting among themselves. And it's cool these days to shoot a gun sideways, I'm told. But you think about how a gun kicks. That means the bullets get spread out left to right, and they almost never hit each other, but they shoot everything else in creation. But that townhouse in a neighborhood of significant transition went for $785,000. Who can afford that? That's the challenge of what's happened in D.C. and who can live there. So I will conclude, we need to make cities work. All of us probably would agree, and probably in this room, that one of the things I hope from a new administration, no matter who wins, although I have my own opinions on that, they can't do worse, in my humble opinion, but they easily can do a lot better. And I hope that high on the agenda is an urban policy. But if we succeed, the next challenge are going to be the ones of what Marty called our own refugee problem. How do we integrate? And I could go on, and I shouldn't, but the notion of we have a green-collar jobs effort in D.C. where all the jobs of cleaning up the river, stormwater containment, green roofs, photovoltaic installation, all of those jobs, we're creating a job program to train the at-risk youth from these neighborhoods. Because there's a natural ladder. It's hard to have a job program in IT because the first rung is so high. But if you're going to do it in the environment, your first job can be cleaning the river or working on a roof. Painting a roof white from having it black tar is the single best energy efficiency project you can do. We want to build and use the environment as what's part of our solution. But thank you very much for indulging me, and thanks very much.
Thank you, George. You ended up on a nice transition, talking about jobs and job training. Our last speaker is Omar Freilla, who has been named one of the new school of activists most likely to change New York City by City Limits magazine. And that's just one of many awards he has received in recognition of his activism on behalf of communities and the environment. He's the founder and director of the Green Worker Cooperatives, an organization dedicated to the creation of worker-owned and environmentally friendly businesses in the South Bronx. He's also served as program director for Sustainable South Bronx and has worked with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. His writing on community opposition to transportation racism in New York City was published in 2004 in Highway Robbery, Transportation Racism and New Routes to Equity, edited by Robert Bullard. He's also written for the journal Race, Poverty, and the Environment and blogs by City Limits and the Drum Major Institute. Holds a master's degree in environmental science from Miami University of Ohio and a BS from Morehouse College.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, I do need to get something up here. How are you all doing?
Great.
Great. Okay. We can turn it. Thanks. Well, my name is Omar Freilla, and I'm founder and director of an organization in the South Bronx called Green Worker Cooperatives. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our organization and what it is that we're involved in, what the work comes out of. But first, I would like to share a very short little story that, since there's a high concentration of policy wonks, you'll appreciate this. When I first started doing environmental justice work in New York City, it was about 10 years ago. And at the time, I'd met Denny Taveras, who's one of your alum here. And at the time, I had been working with an organization called the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. And one of the very first campaigns I had gotten involved in was a fight against a waste transfer station. And this was a waste facility that had been proposed for one community in the South Bronx called Hunts Point that was proposed to handle about 5,200 tons a day of garbage. So this was garbage that was going to be put onto a barge, sent up to the Bronx, and then put onto a train. And it was billed as a great and wonderful thing for the city of New York and for the community. It was, at the time, just one of many, and a laundry list of waste facilities that were already on the table and had already been built and were up and running, and that had gone into place for about 20 years before then. So this was just one of many things, and I remember helping to organize against that waste facility being sited in this community. And it was seen as just one out of a laundry list of garbage facilities that nobody else wanted in their community around the city, but was being pitched as something that would benefit this community and benefit the city as a whole through this community. So people were lining up against it, and we were just learning how to fight. So after this, we were part of this long campaign that culminated in a large public hearing. And we were able to organize the largest gathering of people, largest turnout for people in the neighborhood against something like this. And we pulled out about 700 people to fill up a school auditorium, a middle school auditorium. And on that day, I remember the words of a regulator from the State Department of Environmental Conservation, who was sitting over in the sidelines in the back, just watching the whole drama, the fighting going on and the nonstop barrage by people who were against this waste facility. And this regulator sitting over on the side, gets up and walks out, and then is overheard talking to one of her colleagues, and she says, "The city's like a body, and everybody has a colon to process its waste." So, yeah, in that one statement, that one statement is a wow, but that one statement really embodies what the city's policy is regarding waste management, and how it is that New York City, and I would say every other city and every other town, county in the country, how it handles what it is that nobody else wants. And there's this assumption that the city does work like a body, that every piece of the city has its role, and that meaning that there are communities that have their roles. The Wall Street or Lower Manhattan would be the brains, is considered the brains of the city. Or places, every place has their role, then that means that there are other communities that get the less desirable, non-sexy parts. So, everybody isn't going to be out there being the brain. Some would be the brawn. Some are going to be generating the resources, and others are going to have to be the disposers. If you accept that, then there's not much further that you can really go if you're talking about environmental justice and trying to get to a place where all communities are recognized as being equal, inherently equal in terms of their ability and potential. And you don't have that same level of expectations as far as people go. So there's an assumption just right off the bat that needs to be dealt with if we're to be serious about getting to a point where benefits and burdens are distributed equally. Where one community isn't burdened, doesn't receive all of the burdens while others are getting all of the benefits. And in the United States, the benefits and the burdens are clearly distributed along lines of race and class. So it's the low-income communities and communities of color that wind up bearing the greatest burdens and receiving very few of the benefits. So that's my intro. And along with that, if you accept that kind of an assumption, the fact that we are living in a society that is so wasteful, that is driven by so much consumption, is really a necessary, it's a necessary piece of life. And in order to have that split between communities serving different roles, it's the kind of thing that the two go hand in hand. You can't have a society that is so full of waste without having communities and people that play the role of bearing the burdens. It's the kind of thing where if we weren't generating waste, then we wouldn't have communities that were being used as the dumping grounds. And if you didn't have the communities being used as dumping grounds, then we wouldn't be generating waste. Then the two very much go hand in hand. This is, just that the basic question up there is, for New York City, what does New York City do with 50,000 tons of trash? Now, the regulator from the State Department of Environmental Conservation says, you hand it over to one community. This was one, from the website of one enterprising individual who decided that they were going to make garbage and a chic gourmet item. So they actually went and collected trash from the streets of New York and are selling it online. For the top one is, you can get your own little piece of New York City garbage for $50, put it in a clear plastic box, and the guy signs his name on it. So this is art, right? On the bottom, the guy went a step further, and he collected trash from New Year's Eve celebrations at Times Square. So this goes for $100. So, the issue about if we have a society that is so built on creating waste, then you need to have a place to actually dispose of it. And that's where you have the assumption that there are communities that are built for that purpose, that exist for that purpose. So if we are to get to a point where we have real environmental justice, then we need to get to a point where we're not generating waste. We're moving towards zero waste, and we're recognizing that. So, one of the things that I've always been frustrated with from the mainstream environmental movement is this sidelining of environmental justice and the sidelining of anyone who talks about racial equity and class equity, that this is something to the periphery of an environmental issue. And in my opinion, this is something that is really central, because it's really saying that in order to get to that future, that world that is about zero waste and is about being truly sustainable, then we need to deal with the communities that have been used as the dumping grounds for everything that nobody else wants first. Because these are the places where the chain is already broken, whatever analogy you want to use. These are the places that allow for all of the polluting practices and all of the energy overconsumption to exist. I like to use this analogy of a pressure cooker. Anybody here still familiar with pressure cookers? A couple nods. So if you spend time in the kitchen, a pressure cooker is that big giant thing that you use to speed up the cooking of beans or something else. And the way it works is that there's so much pressure built inside that builds inside of it that aids and it quickens the process of cooking. Without a little attachment on the very top, there's a little hole, a little spigot, and there's a little valve on top that's a whistle. Without that whistle, what you have is a pipe bomb. With that whistle, you have an early warning system that your pipe bomb is going to explode. You have it's a release valve. It's that little warning sound that goes off and says, the pressure is building up inside. You need to handle this situation. You need to turn off the fire. areas like the South Bronx or the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, these are areas that are that little pressure release valve. We've been that early warning system for the rest of the country and the rest of the world that says that there's something very wrong with this system, and if we don't handle it quickly, then all of us are going to suffer. And we've already gotten to that point where all of us are suffering. So now, instead of talking about an isolated, one isolated oil refinery on the Gulf Coast being a toxic soup, we're talking about global warming as a global problem. So it's already gotten to the point where it's affecting people on a larger scale. And it's the kind of thing that we certainly could have addressed, but certainly could have addressed in the past by really paying attention to the environmental justice movement, but still have the opportunity to do that. And that picture above is just a picture of the South Bronx back in the 80s, early 80s and late 70s, when it had been decimated by a long series of policies, some of which were alluded to earlier, about how the state and the federal government was treating cities. And New York City and the South Bronx became the poster child of that, the poster ghetto of America. And what we wind up with today are a lot of the things that, as I was saying earlier, nobody else wants. And you can just go clockwise or counterclockwise in any direction you want to go in this picture. And these are just pictures of just that same neighborhood, Hunts Point, in the South Bronx, where I had spent my time doing a lot of work and living. And this was, just from going around, you've got chemical storage facilities over in the top left corner, a sludge pelletizing plant that actually takes sewage sludge and basically bakes it in a big oven and then sells it off as little pellets that wind up going on farms in Florida that get sent back to you in your oranges. So next time you take a bite of a nice juicy orange from Florida, you're actually eating a piece of New York City sewage sludge and everything that goes in it. And there's construction and demolition debris, waste transfer stations, there are power plants. Denny, you know about the power plants that were shoved down the backs of 10 neighborhoods in New York City, all of them poor neighborhoods in the city, 95% of them communities of color, more waste transfer stations, and even recycling facilities that, when they're not operated well, are seen as eyesores. And for the most part, because the communities that they're in are very low on the radar in terms of power and influence, then they're allowed to operate however they see fit. So even recycling has gotten a bad name in communities of color. So some of these, what's up there are things that I mentioned, just a number of different waste facilities, power plants, wastewater treatment plants, sewage sludge processing, and even now warehouse distribution, because much of manufacturing has pretty much gone, and is no longer visible. It still exists even in New York City, but on a much, much smaller level compared to how it was even 30 years ago. So what we've been left with are these vast tracts of land, vacant lots in the industrial parts of the city, where what is there that can be done? There hasn't been too much creativity on the part of city administrators, on the part of the state people who are take as their charge economic development. And so what's allowed to happen is pretty much a free-for-all. So we get the waste transfer stations, we get the best scenario that anyone comes up with in economic development agencies, for the most part, is either retail, a retail establishment, or in one area, or a warehousing facility in what's considered the less desirable part. So what you wind up getting with the warehousing are just incredible amounts of truck traffic, and that has created a situation where the South Bronx is now known as Asthma Alley. So it is an area that has one of the highest rates of asthma in the country. It's about 6 times the national average, and we have been cut up on all sides, so we're completely surrounded by highways on each side. So it's the kind of situation that has resulted in high asthma rates. It's resulted in heavy truck traffic. It's resulted in horrible odors, just that sewage sludge processing plant that I mentioned earlier. You would not want to live next to one. I don't need to say why, but you wouldn't want to live next to one. just for the sake of what's going in. So it's something that has certainly created a pushback on the part of our community in the South Bronx and communities throughout the country that have for decades been used as dumping grounds, and who have now, out of experience, been in positions where we're now able to fight back. And actually, what we've seen, and I'm saying we in terms of the broader environmental justice movement, you have a great level of awareness and understanding and experience that's just come with fighting, fighting against the things that we don't want. And just in the past 10 years, I have seen a huge number of proactive development pushes that have been happening from communities, from our community. So we've had the experience of fighting against the things we don't want, and now we're in positions where we're saying, we're able to preempt the latest advance by a waste facility or some other and say, look, instead of having this waste transfer station, this is what we actually want. We actually, don't want to see our homes raised. This is the kind of development that's green that we actually do want. So all across the country, you're starting to see more and more of these kinds of actions. But one of the things that's always been an issue is really what to do about creating jobs. And there was an example brought up earlier about DC and how there's this push in the community, or a split in the community, about creating jobs and seeing a development that is seen by some in environmental circles as a negative, but is seen as a plus within the local community because there's a demand for jobs. In the South Bronx, there's a desperate need for work. Unemployment rate is extremely high. In the last census, it was as high as 27% in some areas. So what is it that we can actually do to create work that is in a way that is amenable and in line with our principles, in line with the principles of environmental justice, and in a way where we're not compromising our values, where we can actually say we want work, we just don't want work that kills us in the process. So we want work that is actually proactive and green, and we're calling them now green-collar jobs, and the push is to have work be something that can actually improve environmental conditions at best. So our organization formed 4 years ago. Wow. Oh, it's the wrong one? Oh, good. So our organization formed 4 years ago as a way to actually come up with that alternative. And the idea that we've latched onto is pushing zero waste as a job creation strategy, and saying there's a huge amount of material that we are throwing away each and every day. New York City generates about 50,000 tons of trash. 10,000 of it is construction and demolition debris. That is, we're sinking money into holes in the ground, and we're losing jobs because we have a few number of people who are processing a huge amount of waste, and we are throwing it out and exporting it out of the state. Now, the way we see it, if we are actually able to keep that and adopt a zero-waste strategy, then we're actually keeping resources, we're creating new jobs, we're reducing waste, and in the long run and on a global scale, we are avoiding the need to cut down trees in order to build doors when you can just keep the doors in circulation. So that is what led to our very first enterprise, which we structured as a worker cooperative, which if we have time at some point, I can talk about, and I would love to talk about. But we are about creating green businesses that are owned by their workers and that are actually able to improve environmental conditions. And so we've developed this idea about our first cooperative, which is taking this aspect of reuse and saying we're going to create a building materials reuse store. And this slide and the next two are just examples of reuse stores around the country that handle construction and demolition debris. What would have been construction and demolition debris. But in reality, our sinks, their tubs, their hardwood flooring, they are windows, they're lighting fixtures, they're things that you get at a Home Depot, only that they would have been thrown out previously. So what we've done is we've created a reuse store that is able to go out and pick up building materials, bring them back to a warehouse, and put them up for sale. This is Urban Ore. This was the first one of these, the longest established one out in Berkeley, California. They've been around since 1980. And this is our very first worker cooperative no sexy pictures yet. But it's called Rebuilder Source. And as far as we know, it is the first worker cooperative reuse store for home improvement anywhere on the planet. So there are others that are reuse stores, but this is the first one that's actually owned by the people who work there. So it's the kind of thing that we see as a benefit for our community because it's able to actually take material that normally goes through these waste transfer stations, these temporary waste facilities that always handle material. And in just one, you can see 5 people working there, and they would handle about 1,000 tons a day. We're starting Rebuilder Source with 5 people, handling a ton a day if we're lucky. So if your goal is just to move a lot of stuff and get it out, consider everything trash and get it out and move as much as possible, then a Rebuilder Source is not the way to go. But if your goal is to reach sustainability, and your goal is zero waste, and your goal is to actually create jobs where there are no jobs, then a Rebuilder Source is the ideal way to go, because we're creating 500 times as many jobs as any transfer station. Just for the same amount of material takes 500 times as many people to operate. And this is something that it's not done through as a city agency. It's something that's done out in the world by people who are trying to make this thing sustainable on its own and profitable, and it's something that they can use to create their own livelihood. So it's something that we see as a great alternative to the wasteful practices that we've been accustomed to and that we've been using. The worker ownership model, I actually go back there for a second. The worker ownership model we came to because we feel that this is something that is wonderful on so many different levels. It creates accountability to the community. Just from the environmental justice perspective of having accountability. We have businesses that operate that are absolutely not accountable to the community that they're in. If you have owners who are actually working there, who are actually living in the neighborhood, then you are much less likely to gas your neighbors. You just don't get a good reception at the supermarket. So, there's an intrinsic level of accountability that's built into that when you talk about what's the ownership of one of these enterprises. You are able to retain wealth because money is that's being generated by workers. It stays in the hands of the workers who are the owners. They're more likely to live there. That means that they're spending money in their community as opposed to having the money head out to another state, several states over or several countries over. So it's empowering workers. It's making democracy a daily reality because the workers are actually engaged on a day-to-day basis and are making decisions. And to be honest, there just aren't many places in this country, in our daily lives, even though we profess to be a democracy, it's not a democracy of daily life. We are not engaged in empowering decision-making on a daily basis on an institutional level. As when you were here as students, you didn't get to decide what the policies were at Princeton. In school, just at a very young level, students don't decide what happens in the schools. As workers, we don't get to decide what happens in the workplace. As young people, don't often get to decide what happens in their home. So there are so many instances where just growing up, we've been accustomed and taught to learn how to be employees. And what we're really trying to create is to unravel that and create opportunities for people to really have one time in a position where they're empowering themselves. So that is just creating accountability, building that into the system. So it's something that we really love, and all of our favorites is you can tell people that you fired your boss. So these are just a few worker cooperatives in New York City. If you want more info on worker cooperatives, there's a National Federation of Worker Cooperatives called the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. There's going to be a great national gathering in New Orleans happening this summer, so I invite anyone to come check it out. And our website is up there if you're interested. So thank you very much.